This is Chapter 5 of The Guardian of Ailos. When Nelson opened his eyes, the room wobbled back into form. He saw that the pillars of light were gone, but the familiar glow of blue filled the dome of the cave. Sid sat perfectly highlighted in the center of the mosaic, reading. She came running over as Nelson started to push himself up from the ground. "Whoa, whoa, take it slow," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" Nelson finished his ascent. His legs were unsteady, so he casually leaned against the wall with one hand and put the other on his hip, playing it cool as if Sid wouldn't recognize the effort. She was kind, though, and so she played along. "Sid, it was horrible," Nelson said. The touch of the wall reignited his memory of the vision. He turned to his friend with urgency spilling from his eyes. "The dragon! I saw it. And, and there was a woman, a warrior dressed in armor. Everything was black, burnt by fire, and she was screaming." Nelson threw his hands up on Sid's shoulders and shook her. "We have to save her." He pointed with all vigor toward the door behind him. "Okay, tell me, what did you see?" As Nelson described his vision, Sid's eyes widened. She looked from Nelson to the red gem, then back to the mosaic on the floor. "Now," she said slowly, I think we've stumbled onto something big, really big." She pointed to the mosaic. "Look at the three worlds in the image. I think they're connected to these doors." Nelson followed her gaze, his mind racing. "So, that red gemstone, it's connected to the dragon's world?" Sid nodded. "And the screams you heard, they might be coming from there." She bit her lip, her face a mixture of determination and fear. "Well then," he said, "we need to figure out what's going on. We need to help." He stood up straighter. "So, what's our next move?" Sid bowed her head. Her eyes carried a look of defeat. "What? You don't believe me?" Nelson asked, dropping his hands. "Yes, Nelson, I do. She grabbed his hands as they fell. "We can't go through that door. At least not yet." "What do you mean we can't go through that door? The stone, your locket. They have to be some kind of keys, right?" A nervous smile crossed Nelson's face. "I'm sure if we just—" Nelson started reaching toward Sid's locket. She pulled back before he could grab it. She didn't like the look in his eyes. "Please, just listen for a second," Sid continued. "After you passed out, I searched everywhere for answers. I was scared that something was really wrong. I read the poem, the one from earlier, over and over again. I traced every inch of this mosaic and inspected every character on the walls. Nothing made sense. It was all gibberish. And then I found it. Look at the doors now." She gestured to the other two across the room. The images around them, they matched the mosaic on the floor as well. "Okay, so what?" Nelson jabbed. He knew his tone stung Sid when she winced at his question, but it was too late. And he knew what he saw. He knew that there was someone that needed their help. And they needed to act fast. "The king," Sid continued. "There's a hole in his right hand, and it is the exact same shape as my locket. Look." Sid stepped back and raised her necklace. "Just before I saw you slumped over, I put it into the mosaic, and the doors came back to life. But they remained shut. I looked all over the place, and finally, I found another one." She pointed at a small hole next to the wooden door. The crazy look in Nelson's eyes retreated as he listened. His mind started turning the information over, looking for an answer. He pinched his chin and asked, "Then why two?" "Not just two," Sid said. She pointed at the next door, the silver door. It also had a similar hole. All of the doors have one. I'm pretty sure the one in the mosaic releases all of the doors, but without another key, we can only enter one at a time. Then why is the light gone? Asked Nelson. Do you remember when we found the book last night? The poem I spoke? Do you remember it? Maybe, Nelson replied. Something about a guardian and a dragon and words, Sid said, opening the book. Nelson took a small step back from the open book. Something about it felt off, like it was too powerful. There was fear, like when someone lights a match and your first instinct is to step away, but also to stare. The book said that when the guardian spoke the words, a door would open, Sid continued. Okay, yeah, I remember. But what words? Nelson asked. Sid smiled. Yes, that smile. And then she stepped into the center of the room. You're going to want to stand back, she said. And when Nelson didn't move, she cocked her head and raised her eyebrow. Then she made a shooing motion with her hand. Nelson lifted his hands in surrender. Okay, okay. I thought you meant to stay put. He took a few steps back until he met the wall and lifted his thumb as if to ask, Is this good enough? Sid nodded at the gesture, and then she closed her eyes and lowered her hands down by her side. As she spoke the words, her arms angled outward, and Nelson saw her hands start to glow. The words she spoke were unintelligible, but he didn't have time to notice. As soon as the final syllable left her lips, a mighty wind filled the room and rushed out from its center. The force of the wind slammed into Nelson, sticking him to the wall. Light began to stream from Sid's eyes and mouth as she lifted herself from the ground. At least, he thought it looked like she was doing the lifting. It was hard to tell with his fiery curls flapping in the wind, but through squinted eyes he saw, little by little, the light imbue the ground beneath his friend, traveling into the walls surrounding him and climbing steadily like vines until at last the whole dome shone with golden light. Then Nelson saw the columns of light arise from the mosaic, reappearing just as before. Naturally, he turned to follow the red light to the golden door. Something buzzed inside of him. His eyes longed to see what was inside the stone. What was it housed beneath the glassy surface? As the light made its way around the room and filled every corner, the furious gale began to subside. Nelson's face felt numb and his back sore from being held up against the old rock wall. His hair a matted mess. Sid descended to the ground with grace, and a glow of golden light still kissed her cheeks. Nelson couldn't take his eyes off her, and as his gaze failed deeper into hers, he felt a strange knot form in his stomach. The golden door, it called for him. The stone, it gripped him. It glistened in the golden light, like a star-studded night sky, and the flash of red danced like fire. Curiosity only grew as he remembered the voices. If only he could hold it, he thought. Then he would have all the answers. Plus, if there was someone truly trapped, shouldn't they want to save them? Yes, he thought. It would be good to know what lies behind. Nelson, no! Sid shouted from across the room. Without realizing, Nelson stood only inches away from the door, his hand already reaching for the stone. Again, Sid shouted, but this time something traveled with her voice. It was warm, like the first drop of sun in spring, but it also stung like the sensation of a fresh paper cut. He didn't understand the words, but at once he came to. His eyes blinked, and the magnetism of the gem lost its hold. Nelson felt embarrassed, so he just laughed and said, Gosh, Sid, I was only looking. He turned and waved a hand at her. Plus, this one doesn't even look like the other ones. It's too ugly. You think maybe that's what happens to them when you put them in the door? Sid did her best to believe her friend, but even the smile she gave was half-hearted. Yeah, she said with hesitation. Maybe, but what I do know is that all the stories in here, she poked the cover of the old book, are warning me about that dragon. Sid pointed at the image surrounding the door. I don't think we can trust anything about that door. And what exactly does that thing, Nelson said, pointing a sharp finger at the book, say about this dragon? If there really is a dragon at all, then how do we know he's even behind this door? Plus, Nelson continued, pointing at the door, this gem probably doesn't even work. As a final gesture, Nelson spun his head back toward the door and in a nonchalant kind of way flicked the stone. Sid gasped as the stone flung free and started to fall. Nelson braced as the stone crashed into the rock floor. He didn't know what for exactly. He just expected something bad to happen. To both of their surprise, nothing happened at all. The stone, which upon impact revealed that it was in fact not a gem, but glass, simply cracked as it clinked around on the ground. Nelson let out a big sigh. He was afraid to turn and look at Sid, expecting her to be angry, but when he did, he found the opposite. She was standing there, with terrified eyes and mouth wide open, like a kid who just broke a cookie jar. They made eye contact, and after a moment, after they both decided nothing bad was going to happen, they laughed. For a good while, they held their stomachs and wiped their tears as laughter filled the cave. Then Sid looked with all sincerity at Nelson. Okay, she said, before you go and say I told you so, let me first admit that maybe you were right about the stone. Maybe. Nelson, very satisfied by his friend's confession, nodded and said, why, thank you. But, Sid continued, I still don't like the idea of going through that door. There's just something about it that gives me the creeps. Probably the ugly dragon, Nelson whispered, waving his thumb over his shoulder and winking. Stop it. Seriously, it's more than that. Plus, with everything I've been reading, I think we should go through the wooden door. In all of the images, Sid pointed at the mosaic and then over to the middle door. The king has a crown of wood. Okay, that makes sense, he said. It made no sense. The real question is, how do we open the door? Nelson asked. Oh, that's easy. All you need is one of these. Sid held up her locket. She walked over to the wooden door and pressed the locket into the palm of the king. I haven't figured it all out yet, but the book says something about a war. And the only way the king and queen could defeat the dragon was to entrust the keys to the realm, lockets, to a warrior, the guardian of Ailos, the one who defeated the dragon's army. All three of them cast him out of the realm. The lockets were passed down from generation to generation until finally the legend stops. At least, that's what I've got so far. Sid shrugged and then placed her palm over the locket. With the other hand, she covered the seal on the door. After whispering a phrase, the door cracked with a stiff pop and slid open. Bright sunlight flooded the room, so bright that Nelson had to shield his face. As he did, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something sparkle. It was the stone from the golden door. He couldn't help it. He reached down and picked it up. Come on, Nell, Sid shouted in glee. You have to see this. She already had 2 feet out the door, and with one hand holding onto the door frame, beckoned him with the other. Quickly, he hid the stone behind his back. Okay, I'm coming, he said. Well, don't take too long. We've got a world to explore. Sid smiled, then took off running, laughing as she went. But what? Nelson started to shout, but who was he kidding? There was no stopping Sid. When he reached the door, it had already swung shut, so he pushed it open, one hand on the door, one hand holding the stone. As the door creaked open, he felt a breeze jump up and kiss his cheek. The smell of salt water found his nose. The sky before him was such a brilliant blue, one that reminded Nelson of a painting that his mom kept in her bedroom. The sun was warm on his face, but not too warm, and the sound of seagulls squawked in the distance, singing in chorus with the crashing waves. He stepped out onto the sparkling sand and then paused. He remembered the stone in his left hand. He looked down at it and saw that it was much smaller now. It was no longer the size of his palm, but rather it looked like a pebble, a bright, shiny red pebble about the size of a human eye. Veins of black raced around it like wild rivers, and the texture of it felt smooth as he rubbed it with his thumb. Nelson could hear his friend shouting in the distance. He assumed she was yelling about the water because when he looked up, he saw her splashing around like a maniac. He couldn't help but laugh as he placed the stone in his pants pocket for safekeeping and closed the door behind him. As he watched Sid playing in the water, a mixture of excitement and unease settled in his stomach. They had stepped into a whole new world, full of wonder and potential danger, and in his pocket he carried a secret, a small red stone that seemed to whisper of another path. Nelson took a deep breath of the salty air and started walking towards Sid. The weight of the stone pressed against his leg with each step, a constant reminder. Part of him wanted to tell Sid about it right away, but another part, a part he didn't quite understand, urged him to keep it hidden. Like the stone in his pocket, he shoved his worries down deep. For now, his friend was running off into a strange world all by herself. "Hey, wait for me!" he shouted into the clear blue sky and ran after his friend. Thanks for listening to Chapter 5 of The Guardian of Ailos. As a reminder, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment or come find us on Substack, and we'll be right back next week with Chapter 6.